everyone for joining this session. I think we got an hour and a half. I just want to really make sure we're all on the same page. So today we are not supposed to make any decisions whatsoever. So I think that's a key point here. What we're really willing to do is walk through the SBTi, and the SBTi is important in light of the 1.5 degree discussion that we've had. Just to remind people, a couple of reasons I think why it's important. I think that trajectory probably fits better with most of the signatories' ambitions, which is getting to zero. The other thing, it also tackles the life cycle emission. And I think something else that we probably start seeing as well in the next kind of reporting session, it probably also makes more the shape of the trajectory, which today is very linear. And I think we're all struggling to have linear kind of reductions in the short term. So I think in that sense, it all makes sense. I think that we're going to look into this. We will be coming back later on this. We're going to have a lot of opportunity here to ask questions to UMass and Smart Freight Center, who are both on the line. The trajectory is out, so that was something that we had been waiting for quite a while. So that is out now. So we really want to go through that and make sure that everybody is well equipped to go back to their own organization, have a look, so we can actually make progress in this discussion. So thanks for attending. I'm going to give it back to Anna, who's got a couple of announcements, I think, logistically, and then we're going to get going.
Thank you, Jan, for the introductions. I put in some slides, but to show you what's the plan for today, but it's very simple. We have Jan-Mark from UMass and Alan from Smart Freight Center here with us today to walk us through the SBTi guidance that was published recently. And that's what we'll use the slides for. And then we have some governance pieces from me. I want to remind you or let you know that this meeting is being recorded. So now you're all aware. And we'll, of course, make you the recording available in case you want to come back to the content afterwards. If you have any questions, there is a chat that you're welcome to use. Otherwise, we're a big group, but not that big group that it wouldn't manage. So you're welcome to jump in anytime. But we're going to have a big Q&A session once the slides are over. So that's for the flow. Are there any questions before we start, or can we dive into the presentation? With that, I think we're ready to go. So I'll pass it over to Jean-Marc.
Perfect. Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Anna. Yes, so as Jan said, today, the whole point of today is to give ourselves some time to ask all of those questions whilst we're all together, and hopefully clarify everything that's related to 1.5 within the context of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which was launched in November last year. So I'm just going to basically the structure of the next few slides would be a short introduction of what SBTi is and how it works. Looking at what we're proposing that we take on as SCC from the SBTi methodology, and then going through sort of things that have happened since we were discussing this last, so since we shared this first in spring last year, and then go into the actual sort of nitty-gritty of details of what's behind the science-based target. So in this way, we'll build the context and then go down into the detail that is more concerning to most of us, I think. We can start with the first slide. So starting off, probably most of you will be familiar with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but just in case, so the Science-Based Targets Initiative is all about target setting for businesses, And it also provides verification and validation of those targets as sort of a part of the package if you sign up to it as a user. And obviously, there's lots of different sectors. SBTi covers almost all sectors of the industry. And what we're discussing here is just the maritime transport part of it. So you might be signed up to SBTi on a corporate level. Some of your companies might already be signed up to it. But this is specifically just for the maritime transport that we're discussing. It's run by those people that you see there. So WWF, CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, World Resource Institute, and United Nations Global Compact, who sort of in their own right are all reputable institutions. And they've built the reputation of SBTi as being sort of a robust and gold standard methodology to do this climate-based target setting, and then also do the validation work behind it when you commit to it. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're focusing on the maritime guidance from SBTi, and just to sort of start showing some of the differences that there are between SBTi and Sea Cargo Charter or other initiatives, is that SBTi can be applied to basically any kind of business or company that has maritime transport within its business or operating profile. So sort of there's the people who work firsthand with shipping, like the ship owners and ferry operators and charters like yourselves. But it could also be, let's say, a consumer goods company who's shipping its raw materials or its finished products from one place to another, and also wants to set itself a target for carbon emission reduction. So basically, in one sentence, we can describe what SBTi offers as a toolkit to measure your carbon intensity of the activity that you currently have, and then set targets that will inform your decision making in the short term, in terms of short-term goals, short-term actions, but it's all adding up to a long-term goal, that is the 1.5 degree alignment. So if we go to the next slide, what the sector-specific guidance looks like, sort of tangibly, is the technical guidance document. So this is sort of similar to how we have a technical guidance document for Sea Cargo Charter. Science-based targets has one for each of the different sectors that it covers, which basically contains all of the details, most of the details that we will discuss here. And this is where I tell anyone who would like even more detail in terms of references or resources, they can refer to this document or our own SCC document, which Anna has shared as well. They're basically, the content is the same, but there's a bit more detail in there, especially the sources where everything has come from. What goes with the technical guidance is a tool that SBTi has. So the tool is there to basically input what your current activity is, project what your activity will be like over the next, let's say, 5 or 10 years in terms of growth, hopefully. And therefore, setting yourself maybe this 5 or 10 year deadline, it gives you sort of what your carbon intensity needs to look like in order to achieve that target. It's different from what we've got for SCC, where our sort of tool, which again Anna shared, basically just shows you your required carbon intensity for your voyage. And this is slightly different because it's more based on telling you where you need to be in 5 years' time, for example, based on your own company's projection. If we go to the next slide, please, Anna. So how it works in practice. So if you are interested as a company to use SBTi as your framework, you sort of have these 5 steps. You commit by submitting a letter to SBTi itself, establishing your intent. And then there's develop there, where basically you evaluate what your current emissions intensity are, and establish a target using the tool, and using and putting in a proposed plan of how you will achieve that. That is then submitted to SBTi for validation. Then there's an element also of disclosure as well, where that needs to be communicated widely within public, and also your internal stakeholders. And then you need to disclose how you are performing against that target. And SBTi also has a review cycle that happens every year that validates what you're doing when you provide some evidence for that. So if we go to the next slide, basically this is trying to spell out really clearly how SBTi and science-based targets will be related. So everything that I mentioned up to here is basically how the whole concept of SBTi works. And obviously, at the foundation of all of that is this 1.5 degree trajectory, which we were discussing last year. So it's still the same trajectory. So what we're proposing here is that the GMF initiatives, as you might know, we're having the same workshop with all 3 initiatives in the next couple of weeks. So that the initiatives use the 1.5 degree trajectory. So that's the rate of carbon intensity reduction. That is at the heart of the SBTi maritime target setting. And that is the only thing that we are proposing that we use from SBTi. Having basically what that, if you decompose the elements of that, basically what it implies is that we're using the carbon budget and the assumptions that go behind establishing that carbon budget, fuel mix assumptions into the future over the period up to 2050, the shape of the curve, which we had previously called S-curve. In SBTi language, it's called logistics curve. It's basically just a change in terminology. It includes life cycle considerations, as Jan mentioned, and also those greenhouse gas species, not only CO2. So this is what we're proposing. So the target setting, so setting yourself a target, we're not proposing that. We're not proposing using the target setting tool. It's just basically keeping SCC methodology as it is right now, but just adding this 1.5 degree trajectory. And then next slide, please, Anna. So just to recap, because we've had quite a long gap of not talking about this in this SCC sphere. So I just wanted to give you an update from spring 2022, when this all starting moving in earnest quite quickly. What has happened since then related to this specifically. So as I just mentioned, there has been no material change in the numbers, the shape, the curve at all. So all of the numbers that we presented last year are still the same. And it's what went into the published version of the SBTi. Since over the past year, we've had some very intense internal scrutiny from SBTi itself. So we had quite a lot of focused discussions about very specific parts of the assumptions, and that's why you'll see a change from the technical guidance document. If you see the one that was published by SBTi initially, this one now has the final published one has a lot more text around the justification and a lot more sources to justify all of the decisions taken to build the trajectory. And as you might know, we had the formal launch in November last year. We also had a launch webinar as well. think some of you had attended that as well. And sort of quickly following that, we had the UN high-level expert group basically publishing this document about sort of guidelines on target setting for different institutions, and it singled out the Science-Based Targets Initiative as sort of the gold standard way of doing this, or a very good way of doing it, because I think gold standard is a misleading term because everything can change. So yeah, so basically the core elements of it, that it's on a well-to-wake basis. It involves all of the greenhouse gas species. It defines a trajectory to 1.5 based on IPCC. These are all elements that the UN high-level expert group points out as being fundamental to a legitimate way of setting your targets, which is encouraging for us because we're getting sort of sanctioning from the highest level that this is a good, robust way of defining 1.5 degrees. And just historically, sort of looking back into how the trajectory was developed, so this started way back in 2020, where ourselves, Smart Fate Center, and WWF put our heads together with a technical working group, which had, in the next slide, I'll just show you who was involved in that technical working group, which involved a different range of stakeholders. And that took us up to March 2021, where we published the first draft for public consultation. And there was a period of 3 weeks for public consultation where we got feedback back. And that was sort of when we saw the change from linear to S-curve based on the feedback from the public consultation. Following that, we had several focus groups specifically targeting elements that came from industry that were slightly contentious, or there needed more explanation, or there was some sort of uncertainty around them. And then, as I said, in 2022, we had quite severe scrutiny internally from SBTi, which led to final approval at the end of November, and was then publicly released. If we go to the next slide, Anna. So some sort of external feedback, I guess, which was not directly related to SBTi, but again gives us more confidence in what we're doing. Well, not what we're doing, what we would propose, and is embedded in the trajectory. So basically, the Maritime Sector for Zero Carbon Shipping published its strategy. I forgot what it's called, for 2050. And there we see that their definition of what is 1.5 degree aligned in terms of carbon budget, or how this is determined, is exactly the same as what we did for SBTi as well. Now, how much that was informed by SBTi is an open question we can put out there, but they felt comfortable enough to put their name behind that. DNV, on a slightly different angle, in their Maritime Outlook 2050, or Maritime Energy Outlook 2050, they published sort of their transport work and trade growth projections, and they also agree with what we are projecting as well. So there we've got sort of the two biggest elements, the carbon budget and the transport work projection, basically supported externally and independently by two other parties. Then there was also sort of literature that was published around the shape of using a logistics curve or an S-curve to model technological transition. And it's a really good paper, which is open access, so you can have a look at it. As you can see, there are some links in these slides, so those will take you to these documents. But also, again, all of this is part of the technical guidance. It's included in the references in that as well. And then we saw the SBTi trajectory being sort of at the heart of some of the activity that we had at IMO over the end of last year. So for MEPC, we saw sort of the submissions from IMRS and WWF both include the 1.5 degree trajectory as at the core of their submissions. And also at MEPC 79, basically lots of countries, their submissions where there weren't exactly sort of a trajectory or something like that, but the most ambitious included, made it a point to include upstream emissions, include the different greenhouse gas species as well, and the ones that actually gave milestones for the decades, they again followed, let's say, the curve rather than a linear approach. So this is all sort of external evidence that helps us build confidence in what we propose for SBTi. If we go to the next slide, just to show you a bit of the people who were involved behind the scenes, but also the scale. So if we go back to that timeline diagram I had before. So as authors, we mentioned was WWF, ourselves, and Smart Trade Center. Technical working group was made up of all of these companies. So as you can see, a mixture, I guess not much bulk in there, I guess Maersk, but it was also a mix that you'll appreciate. This was designed for the whole sector rather than just bulk or anything similar. Public consultation, we had around 260 actual attendees at the launch. And then we had comments from several parties. And these are, I picked the one which sort of resonates most with our world. So the sort of consumer side, manufacturers, engine manufacturers, and sort of shipping actors, but there were several others. The focus groups were basically with mostly the most sort of vociferous people from the public consultation were the ones involved in technical working groups. So sort of by proxy, they made up the focus groups. And then SBTi internally, we had their, I think there was a team of 4 that was reviewing the guidance, which is sort of quite a lot of effort from their side. I think I'll stop there for a couple of minutes, just for any questions.
A question on my side, Jean-Marc, just to clarify. So first of all, this would just replace the trajectory. This doesn't imply that you have to sign up for the SBTi as a company, right?
Let's move to the next slide, Anna. I think that will answer. I think, yeah, it's best having questions after this. So just to answer your question, Jan, and probably other questions, these 3 sort of very clear points that we wanted to make. Being a signatory to SCC does not imply you're compliant with SBTi, because the processes are different. They're led by different people, and also their scope and coverage is different. Signatories that want to join SBTi obviously are highly, it's highly recommended, but they have to do this independently. So SCC, as it stands now, unless anything changes, sort of doesn't connect that dot. And in talking about advisory, so ourselves will not provide assistance with SBTi compliance or target development or target setting or using that tools under the SCC framework. We'd be happy to do that separately, but not under sort of the advisory agreement that we have with SCC. So yeah, so maybe that has answered part of it, Jan.
Yeah, no, I think thanks for the clarification. And then the other question I had is, this trajectory, as new information gets available, I would assume this gets updated, right? Is there a kind of a view on how often this trajectory will get updated?
So I think one thing that we need to understand as SCC and obviously all of the GMF initiatives is that sort of we don't have ownership of this. So with the trajectory that we have right now, we can change, we can do
Yep.
as long as we're justified. This is sort of in the hands of SBTi. And by saying that we are using this trajectory, we are sort of running a bit of a risk because this is not now completely in our hands. At the moment, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure if you know at all, but my impression is that these are revised every 2 years. But obviously there's ongoing. So currently we ourselves and Smart Trade Center are supporting the launch of the trajectory. So we're keeping, if we get any feedback that is noted and then submitted as a proposal for any changes that need to be done or we think should be done. But again, we can't guarantee or we don't have ownership on this or if this will actually happen over 2 years.
Understood. Thanks.
I don't think that there is a certainly at the moment a formal cycle for updates. I think it will depend a little bit on SBTi and what funding it gets, because it's looking across all sorts of sectors. And at the moment, I don't think this is actively on their radar. And I'm not sure that it would benefit them to be updating it too frequently, because every time you update something, everybody in a sector has to adjust everything, and then you just annoy people if you do it too frequently. So there's a balance there. You can't let the science get too far out of date, but you can't disenfranchise your user group either.
No, I agree. It's just good. It's just to kind of level set a little bit the expectation. So if you're going to go with this trajectory, we don't think this is going to get changed dramatically in the first couple of years, right?
Not imminently, no.
Okay, not, yeah.
Clear. Any
Okay,
other
so-
questions? Or otherwise, we keep going.
Perfect. Thanks, Jan. So if we move to the next slide, Anna, just some sort of reasons for using SBTi trajectory. I think the advantage is that we're not reinventing the wheel. This is something that is usable, and we're lucky enough to sort of have the people who wrote it and built it from the ground up as part of the advisory. So it's sort of a no-brainer. But it's always good to see it endorsed by so many sort of different parties independently for its robustness and that's something that is setting the course for the industry in terms of target setting. It also aligns with the most progressive countries at IMO. So what these most progressive countries are pushing at the IMO as the ambition for the initial strategy update, as you might know, in the next MEPC at MEPC 80 in the summer, and there's going to be a decision made about what the update to the initial strategy looks like in terms of targets. So we know that if we sign up to this sort of, we are definitely not going to be outdone, let's say, by the IMO. It's also gone through a process of public consultation and sort of industry involvement in that as well. And SBTi as a whole is already sort of well established and well known throughout this world. Again, it was reviewed by cross-sector experts. So the experts that reviewed this especially internally at SBTi are not shipping or maritime-based people. So they were looking at it purely objectively on the way this was developed for what it is, not because it was sort of shipping specific, as you can see, and SBTi on the whole is a non-shipping specific origin. So some criticisms for schemes that are industry-led might be that, oh, well, but these guys are just doing something to look out for their interests. This is completely independent from any sort of shipping actors. And as I said, some of your companies might already have a commitment to this on a corporate level, and maybe internally already have the structures to operate this and manage this. And also, if we manage to get this through all three initiatives, we have sort of harmonization across all 3 GMF initiatives, SBTi also, and we're also sort of trying to align as many of the initiatives we're involved in with this as well. So we're speaking with the Climate Bonds Initiative. As we know, there's COSEV and a few other initiatives which we're trying to harmonize together under this sort of one umbrella, or this one sort of heading at least. So Alan, next slide. I try to basically put together some points with a yes or no comparison. This is quite abbreviated, but I think it's a good lead into the next slides where we go into the specifics. So looking at metric, both metrics use initiatives use EEOI. So that's brilliant. It's what we're already used to. So this is SCC if we uphold 1.5-degree trajectory as we're proposing. So this would include life cycle emissions. It would include greenhouse gas species. But basically, that is where the similarities end. So SCC would not be SBTi compliant. There's no target setting. There's no short-term or long-term target setting by the individual signatories. Obviously, we've got our trajectory, but it doesn't imply that you have to set specific targets. There's no inclusion of the company's activity sort of in what your reduction target setting process is. And there's no requirement for an action plan, obviously, with SCC. SCC is all just about disclosure, whilst SBTi is about target setting, action plan, and disclosure as well. We are working on a more extensive document, which sort of does this comparison in 2 pages, just to have a bit of a reference document that we can quickly flick to if you have any questions or want any reassurances about the differences between the initiatives. So this was the first part where it was sort of an overview of the SBTi mostly and where the initiatives are similar or not. And the next part, we'll jump into the details, which sort of you might already be familiar with the activity that we did last year, but I think it's still useful to go through. So again, I think this is a natural point for any questions or any thoughts or comments up to now.
I have a question. Sorry.
Please go ahead, Marcia.
Yeah. Is it correct to say that SBTi is looking at the total emissions, meaning that if the world trade through shipping is growing, you automatically cannot be compliant with SBTi because your emission may grow, but the per ton emission is going to be lower?
No, it's not absolute. It is an intensity-based scheme. So it looks at the intensity and not the absolute amount of CO2. So it captures that by having that as carbon intensity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we are having some internal, because we are SBTi signatories, and we are having some just conversations around that point, because there are understandings that we should be as a company as total emissions reduction and not intensity. But yeah,
we have the same discussions outside. But I think what's important here is that the measure is the EEOI, right?
Yeah.
But
I think there's a risk of derailing this conversation a little bit into what SBTi means, because SBTi has both a total emissions and an emission intensity metric. But for the purposes of how SCC applies this, we're only interested in the EEOI trajectory.
No, so fair. Now answers my questions. We have both, so depending how you apply for it.
Yeah.
Okay. Jürgen?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question as well, related to the two topics, like at the bottom of the screen. If Chicago Charter would align with SBTi, I missed the first 30 minutes, by the way, so maybe I missed that part. Would that mean that we commit ourselves to do to those two action points on a company level?
No, you would need to sign up as a company to SBTi. As if you are just a signatory to SCC, you will not need to do any of whatever there's a no against. That won't be a part of it.
So okay, then I'm not sure
We're basically only using the SBTi trajectory proposed for shipping, so we're not signing up for SBTi as such. It's separate.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Just checking the chat. Okay.
I have a question. Maybe it has been discussed earlier regarding the 1.5 degree trajectory. It's a proposed level yet for us. Is there any update that when we're gonna apply that, or on the SCC level, or what is the upcoming situation on that trajectory?
Yeah, so what we wanted to do today is make sure that everybody really understands what it means. And then and we'll get to the end of it, we have two kind of places this year where we as an association can actually make that change if we want to. So that is still to be determined. We wanted to make sure that everybody at least understood very well what we're talking about before moving into that.
Okay, thank you.
Alan and Jean-Marc, on the life cycle emissions, on the fuel factors, are we going to spend some time later on this, or can you tell us a little bit what the base is and what the process could be on?
We'll get to that.
Specific? Okay, good, yeah. Because that's going to be a big one, I think so.
Yes, go ahead, Karin.
Yeah, it's very interesting to have this 1.5 degree curve. And I think personally, I am favorable for that. However, and I guess it is the same for most of your companies, we are either a charterer and either a ship owner. And as you know, yeah, the ship owners have different objectives with CII. And we had a discussion last week about this. It is really difficult internally to have two objectives, meaning following a 1.5 trajectory when my colleague having some ship to manage is following CII objective. So yeah, I don't know how to handle this.
I think I would, Karin, I would take these separate. I think what we're trying to do in the SCC is report our emissions in a standard way and somehow disclose them against a theoretical kind of curve where we should be as an industry, so we can see if we're ahead or behind. I think something like the CII is a regulation, like the EEDI and all these things that might change 4 or 5 times since till we get there. So I think all these things should lead to us complying more to an SCC kind of trajectory over time. But I don't think we can just, there's going to be contradictions between those. I think that is a little bit the issue that we're going to have. And I think the whole industry will have that.
Yeah, thank you.
Echoing Jan's point, I think, well, the IMO will suddenly have to reevaluate everything if the emission strategy is updated, right? CII would not be compliant to anything that is more ambitious. than what they've set up already. So sort of there's, as Jan was saying, that's something that will definitely be updated. But yeah, it is challenging, but I think it's not one for me to answer. So I think I'll focus a bit more on 1.5 at this point.
Well, I think, to be honest, for quite some companies which are broader than just shipping, actually aligning to this is aligning things a little better, because a lot of people, as you say, have somehow the SBTi kind of commitment. That is one, but also many people in our supply chain are all working already with life cycle emissions, and we are actually the only ones not using life cycle emissions. So I think from a supply chain end-to-end kind of perspective, I think this is actually taking one kind of disconnection away and makes it much more aligned.
Well, I would even add a little bit more on that one, because for the companies that are SBTi, what's happening is that we are converting the emissions we are reporting to SCC and using two different KPIs, so double work. So
I agree.
So maybe we can jump into the nitty-gritty, so all of the methodology bits. So Anna, if we go to, we can go to the next slide and just jump into it. And again, you'll probably be familiar with some of these slides because these have been recycled from what we had shared previously, as sort of nothing has materially changed. Although we've added a few more bits and pieces to all of this. So going back to basics, what are we trying to do here? We're proposing to move from what we set out to do with the initial strategy, set up by IMO, which is 50% reduction by 2050 on 2008 numbers, to something that is aligned to a 1.5 degree trajectory. So this is the temperature goal that the IPCC tells us we can't go over to avoid catastrophic climate change. And as you can see on the chart there on the right, there's sort of several different ways of achieving decarbonizing by 2050. And there's sort of, depending on how keen you are to act in this decade or the first couple of decades, it gives a completely different shape to it. So if you go linearly, you get there quickly, but obviously it's quite a immediate action. If you are slower to act, then you give yourself a bit more time, but then the reduction is much more steep. So we've got there sort of the green, yellow, red, and with some research that we've just published at the last IMO for the DFT for the UK government. Every year that you delay, I think increases the final bill by, I want to say $1 billion, but don't quote me on that. So the earlier we do this, the cheaper it is in the long run as well. Rasmus, go ahead.
Hi, Jean-Marc. Thanks for the good presentation so far. I mean, these different curves, I mean, the curve that you're recommending here, the SBTi curve, what does that mean per ship? And do you have graphs and tables over this? I think many of us concern is like, well, how realistic is it that we can actually live up to what we're signing up to? And then how soon is the future going to catch up to the requirements? Is that coming further down the presentation, or yeah? Okay.
Yes, I've got a few examples that we can discuss.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I'm just looking at the time, and I'm seeing that I need to pick up the pace. So if we can go to the next slide, Anna. So yeah, so sort of the four elements that we're proposing that will be different from what we have currently to what we're proposing in SCC is the carbon budget allocation. So moving from 50% reduction to what is 1.5 degree aligned as defined by IPCC. The change in the rate of decarbonization, going from what we have now, which is linear, to the S curve, going to well to wake emissions rather than tank to wake, and adding the other greenhouse gas species that you've mentioned, mainly methane and nitrous oxide. Next slide, please. And these are sort of the 5 points that I will be drilling down into. So carbon budget, how we translate that carbon budget from tank to wake to well to wake, going from a linear to an S-curve, transport demand projection, and then putting everything together to obtain the carbon intensity pathway. Next slide. So starting off with the carbon budget, as we know, we've got historical data from the third and fourth greenhouse gas study going back to 2008. And I know someone submitted a question about this in the survey, and I put this chart just to show where we got our number for the starting budget for the shipping industry. So this is figure 3 in the fourth greenhouse gas study. So basically what we did was literally follow what IPCC tells us we need to do. So reduction of 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, and then going down to 2050, going down to 0 by 2050. And in order to sort of set up this budget, we started with a linear decline over those 2 periods. Can we go to the next slide? And basically, this is what it looks like on a picture. So we've got the squiggly line part, which is the historic data. So that's taken from the greenhouse gas study. And then from 2018, which is the last data point that we got from the greenhouse gas study, we've got the straight line down to 2030, and then another straight line down to 2050 with the reductions that we have in there. As you'll note, this is tank to wake carbon CO2 equivalent. So it only takes into account the operational part, doesn't take into account the upstream emissions, because this was the IMO 4 method, although it is already in CO2 equivalent. So it includes methane and N2O. If we go to the next slide. So this is I think where we got lots of questions, and we need to clarify. So because the budget from the CO2 from greenhouse gas study is only in tank to wake, we had to find a way of sort of translating that into a well to wake approach. So we had this what I call emissions gap that we needed to fill. And in order to define that and project that into the future, we have to make a decision about a fuel mix, and then emissions factors to go with those different fuels. At the time we were developing the SBTi, the document from World Register and ourselves around zero emissions vessels was basically the only source that was there. It was providing something that was decarbonization aligned. So we picked this as our reference point, but also it had proposed 3 different fuel mix projections. And here, in order to keep things as technologically agnostic as we can, and to allow for some of the uncertainty that needs to be built into something like this, we picked the scenario where we've got an equal spread of the different fuel mixes in 2050, and this avoids sort of being biased towards one fuel type or another, and makes things intrinsically more conservative and onerous as well, because you've got more CO2 to reduce by 2050. And also in the LR UMAS document, you also find the assumptions around the emissions factors. And this, I think, is one of the questions that we get quite a lot. We've gotten quite a lot about 1.5. So we've used a set of emission factors, which are the ones that are embedded in the tool that we shared now. And those were used to develop the trajectory. It doesn't mean that they will be the ones that we will be reporting with, but they were the ones that were used to do this exercise. Alan will go a bit more into what we might be using for reporting. But in the interim, as we have said previously, we can use these just as default values for now, whilst sort of we're in this transition period for emissions factors, and even while we wait for the IMO's definition framework for well-to-wake emissions. But sort of these emission factors are not prescribed to the ones that will be used for reporting. So I just wanted to try to make that as clear as possible. So if you go to the next slide, Anna. So basically, taking what we had plotted before, the red line, if we include those CO2, upstream emissions, you can see that sort of at the beginning, the gap is basically almost equal, because that's sort of where it's purely just fossil fuel. So there's a relatively consistent emission factor. And then as we go into the future, those two lines get closer, because obviously the fuel mix is changing. There's less CO2, and it ends up to zero as well. So that's how we go from the historic existing value to 0 by 2050 to well-to-wake 0 by 2050. If we go to the next slide, yes, this is what I just said, I think, in a slide. So it's an evolving landscape, as I'm sure Alan will describe much better than I do. And so we're proposing these interim values. MEPC will show us what they think is the way to go in 2023. So it allows us some flexibility with the technology and fuel supply development, and we've got default values in the interim. So yes, so if we go to the next slide, transitioning from a linear assumption to logistics or S-curve assumption. So basically, this concept of the S-curve comes from the fusion of innovation, which is a theory that tries to describe how new, mostly technological innovations spread within a population. You might be familiar with this technology adoption bell curve, where you've got your innovators or early adopters, and then you've got the bulk in the middle and laggards at the end. So basically, we apply this in terms of what turns into, in this chart, it's called market share. So assuming that spread of population, we apply that curve to our carbon budget in order to allow for the diffusion of innovation of the zero emissions vessels. So basically, because we've already drawn the straight lines, we've got the carbon budget, so that's constrained by the area underneath the graph. And basically what we do is fit a curve around that area. So keeping carbon budget the same, but giving it a different shape. And this has been sort of endorsed by the Getting to Zero Coalition, and also the UN Climate Champions through their work. And you can also see their progress report towards 5% that was published at the end of last year as well, telling us basically how close we are to that and what we need to do to get closer as an industry to that curve. So if we go to the next slide. So now we've gone from the red line to the blue line. Now we've turned that into the purple line. So if you see sort of the area underneath the graph is the same, but we've changed the shape of that envelope. As you can see, up to, let's say 2030, we've got this gradual slope, which then comes down quite rapidly. And basically, sort of anecdotally, it's closer to 0 by 2040 rather than 0 by 2050, because sort of the time that we're buying now with slower action, we'll have to pay for later on this transition, so that decarbonization point comes closer to the present, the longer that you delay. So that's the logic of how we went to an S-shaped curve. Next slide, please. And then looking at the transport demand projection. So this stays the same as what we have currently. What we have currently for Singapore Charter, PP and PPMI. This is the same logic that we've used so far in the technical guidance. And again, it's the same numbers and everything that go into that, and that's used to come up with the carbon intensity. Now, if we go to the next slide, I think this is one of the questions that came from again the survey, which is why do we use this particular scenario, which is RCP 2.6. So RCP 2.6 is a way that the UN defines what the amount of carbon in the atmosphere will look like in the future. RCP 2.6 is sort of one level above the most stringent. The most stringent, so the scenario with the least amount of CO2 allowed, is RCP 1.9. And this question in particular was, why are we not using RCP 1.9 and we're using RCP 2.6? So because RCP 2.6 is not aligned with 1.5, so it's a fair question. But basically, the best defense for that is that this is a projection, and this is a projection of trade, which is very difficult to get right, however many assumptions you make. So as sort of we all know, that these kinds of models or scenario-based analysis is based on a set of assumptions, and sort of the best way to be robust is by being sort of transparent about those assumptions. Basically, the arguments are, as we've seen sort of over the last couple of years, events change trade demand and patterns very dramatically. So sort of the projection for 50 years is as good as a projection for 100 years or 2 years. It is what it is. Basically, we sort of rest a bit on the fact that IMO has chosen that, and it's been peer-reviewed as sort of a sensible way forward. And also, as I said, in DNV's latest work from the end of last year, DNV also projects transport demand on the same kind of level as RCP 2.6 does. And sort of additionally, sort of a stricter demand projection would basically a reduced growth scenario would basically give us also more CO2 to use, because obviously if there's less trade, it means that we've got more of that budget to play with over the future. So taking this approach and using RCP 2.6 makes it more onerous, so it makes the trajectory more ambitious for us to achieve as well. So it's sort of playing it safe in a way. Now, Vivian,
yes,
familiar with the question?
Thank you so much for your answer, Jean-Marc. Again, my issue is that the difference is actually huge between using RCP 1.9 and RCP 2.6. And I simply cannot explain this to my top management. How do I explain that we are going to force it? I mean, the way I understand using RCP 2.6 instead of 1.9 for the transport work while committing to 1.5 is that we, shipping, do commit to 1.5, while the rest of the world, which we are at the service of, commits to well below 2. I don't know how to explain this to my management. And that's a huge issue to get an approval to get to 1.5, actually.
Sure, but I think, do they understand that RCP 1.9 will in fact give us more? I think this is something that we need to maybe discuss.
We can take it offline if you prefer.
Yeah, because.
But I just want to be aware of this. It makes really it's the effort, the additional effort to get to this is enormous. It's huge.
Agreed.
Thank you.
But we'll talk about it. I think there's a bit of not education work, but sort of, because this is such a complex issue, it's really hard when you come to pick sort of one number over the other. It's really hard to justify point blank. So there's lots of storytelling that needs to be done. So yeah, but we'll catch up on that separately. So next slide, please. Yes, so basically this is bringing everything together, nothing new. This is what we've been doing with SCC and the other initiatives so far. So dividing the carbon budget we have by the projected transport demand to get a carbon intensity trajectory. And this is what we end up with. So this is what would be sort of the overarching shape and steepness of the trajectory. Obviously, we would then apply it as we currently do in SCC. We would take a benchmark year. In this case, probably I would recommend taking 2018 because that's the latest data point that we have from IMO4, and using that as our benchmark, and then just using the shape of the curve as a rate of decline for that carbon intensity. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is, I think you've already seen this curve. So this is a comparison between what we have currently and what we're proposing. This can be a bit confusing because we've got the straight line, which is the existing sea cargo charter in tank to wake and CO2, whilst the purple curve is in well to wake CO2 equivalent. So it's very hard to compare them together like this. If we go to the next slide, that was carbon budget. This is carbon intensity. Same comments about the CO2. So the units are different, so it's difficult to compare. If we go to the next slide, when we look at the sort of normalized rate of reduction. So this is basically, if we take what's happening in 2018 and what the future looks like, this is what it looks like. So we basically take the units out of the equation and start everything at 2018, assuming sort of 2018 is 1. What does it look like going up to 2050? So here we start seeing the actual difference between the two trajectories, both obviously at the end point, but we can see how they diverge as you go into the future, and that divergence becomes much larger as you go past 2030. And this sort of starts to elucidate how much of a difference this will be from what we are operating under currently in SCC. And
Jean-Marc, is it fair to say that in this graph you basically take out the growth of trade? You're just looking at the same level?
No, this is well, the assumption in both of these curves, it's the same assumption in trade growth. So they're both assuming the same amount of trade growth.
So you normalize for what in here then?
So here we've normalized for the carbon intensity. So we say if both have the same carbon intensity at the moment or in 2018, what does the future look like? How does the decline look like of the carbon intensity over the future? So basically what I'm saying here is that if your carbon intensity is 1 in 2018, in order to align with the 1.5 in terms of well to wake and CO2 equivalent, it has to be 0.6 by 2028. It has to be a bit less than 0.8 for the current SCC. So this is sort of showing the difference of what the change in carbon intensity needs to look like for the individual vessels.
Okay.
And I think if we go to the next slide, we are jumping into the examples. No, okay, so a bit of a quick slide on implications in terms of the operational side of it, so how we're going to make it happen. Looking at data collection, so the basic elements don't change, so we still need distance sailed, still need cargo transported, we still need quantity of fuel, quantity and type of fuel consumed. However, now we'll need to sort of account for the well to tank proportion of the emissions from those fuels. And there's a few different ways we can do that. We can get the information from the owners themselves. So as we move into the world of alternative fuels, sort of accreditation schemes and certifications will become more important, which I'm sure Alan will talk more about. So that would be another data point that would need to be collected, be it a certificate or a specific carbon factors or emissions factors. Sorry, we can use default emission factors, which is something that we can use in the interim maybe, or decide the scheme would be based on, the initiative would be based on default emission factors. And also if there are things like LNG fuel vessels where the propulsion type makes a huge difference in terms of the emission factors, then that would also need to be sort of known by yourselves in order to work out what the upstream emissions are for that. In this case, the operational emissions also.
Is it fair to say that in an ideal world, you would not have the ship owner, but the fuel supplier or the fuel producer giving that number?
Yes, I think if it's the ship owner providing these numbers, they would have to provide some kind of certification or accreditation. Yeah. But I think
because it's also not always the owner that procures the fuel, right? So that's why.
I leave this discussion to Alan. Yeah. I think because he definitely is more informed than me. And in terms of reporting, my impression is that what we're proposing here is that we still keep the IMO 2050 and just add on the 1.5 degree reporting on top, rather than
that was what we said last time. Yes.
IMO 2050. So I think I've got two quick examples, specific examples for vessels, which I'd like to go through, and then we can jump into some questions. Sorry, I'm just seeing Chris's question. Per propulsion type, agreed, just adds more complexity. But yes, Chris, you're correct. That needs to be taken into consideration. So if you go to the next slide, I just put together a couple of examples. So I try to portray this in a slightly different way to maybe help everyone understand. So as you can see on the left, there's the input side of the tool that we've shared with you. So there we've put in a bulk carrier, 180,000 tons, so much distance, so much cargo carried, and 200 tons of HFO. And basically with those inputs, we get the 2 points that we have. So that's the dot. So we've got the orange dot for the 1.5 degrees and the blue dot for the 2050. So that's the carbon intensity that is the carbon intensity of those two different voyages. As you can see, the lines represent the what the carbon intensity, the required carbon intensity is over that timeline, and the color indicates which if it's 2050 or 1.5 degrees, and also the scale on which you should read those numbers. So again, this comes to the point where we've got tank to wake CO2 and well to wake CO2 equivalent shown on the same chart. So we need to be really clear about what we're showing here. So as you can see, the dots sort of are separated there because we're looking at the different scales, but then also you need to compare them to, so the blue dot compared to the blue line, the orange dot compared to the orange line. And as you can see, like the alignment will be significantly different for a vessel. So if we're looking at 1.5 degrees, 36% misaligned, whilst on the IMO 150, it's 26% misaligned. And another thing that we can show on this chart is, if we imagine, let's say, the blue dot in the future, that voyage still remains at around 6 grams of CO2 per ton nautical mile. You can see that sort of the distance from the blue line is much less than the distance from the orange line. So the orange line means that it's dropping much faster, which requires a lot more accelerated reduction of carbon intensity. If we go to the next slide. Similarly, oil tanker, this time we're under the curve, so we're better in this case than we need to be. And similarly, it's again the same kind of story. So there's these two examples in the slide pack as well for you to have a look at. And yeah, we can see in some cases it's quite confusing because the percentages of alignment or misalignment are quite similar. But if you draw them on a chart, you can see that they mean quite different things. But this, for the next sort of few years, I think up to 2025, you'll see this kind of sort of similarity between them. And this comes mainly because of the difference in CO2 and CO2 equivalent, but also because our 2050 trajectory is pegged at 2012, which means that sort of it hasn't taken into account that carbon intensities have increased since then rather than decreased. So yeah, so those were a couple of examples, and I'm just conscious of the time. I know I rushed through most of this, but it's taken a bit longer than expected. So Anna, Jan, I don't know what you think, if we can jump to Alan straight away, or
I think we should probably go straight to Alan. Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Mark.
And yeah, this is the comparison table, which you've already had for a few years. There's some slides on LNG as well for those interested. But yeah, everything is you've already been supplied with.
Okay, thanks. I'll jump in. I mean, my slides are short in comparison. As we're aware that, as John has pointed out, the alignment with the SBTi 1.5 degree trajectory will require us to be using welter-wake factors. What I've done is pull together a few of the slides that were presented for the signatories meeting last March, and then for the work on emission factors, the preparatory work that was done in the autumn, just as a reminder, really. There's a lot of work that's gone on elsewhere around emission factors for use in transport sector as a whole, that is relevant to the maritime sector, and within that there's a subset that everybody is aware of, which has been done by the European Commission and is ongoing through an IMO consultation group. Lots of elements that need to be taken into account, as we've just discussed previously. Particularly important, I think, is the methodology, because there are lots of different sources out there, but they don't all follow the same methodology. In many cases, the deviation that produces is not huge, but occasionally it can throw in an outlier. So it's important to understand what the methodologies are from some of the sources that might be used. Within that, there's also variability around geography, because there are different approaches potentially being used in different parts of the world for what are nominally the same fuels. Different databases are including different fuels, which can lead to lack of comparability. And clearly, some of these come out of individual modes. So the maritime will have specific values for the likes of HFO or marine diesel oil, which won't necessarily crop up in other databases which are looking at other modes. And so one of the issues that is important, I think, is to consider actually also a need for consistency across modes. And that leads to a big issue basically around establishing consensus, as much as focusing solely on getting to an exact number that can in some way be considered precise. And Jean-Marc's also mentioned the idea of what I've called here a generic list of emission factors, could also be called a list of default emission factors, fuel by fuel, versus the idea that for any individual fuel with nominally the same specification and its provenance can vary, and there can be variations in the actual emission factor of that fuel if you were to get it certified and audited. And that comes into the question about whether you do allow certification programs for signatories to bring in a value that's relevant particularly to the fuel that they are buying or their vessel owner is buying. If you could click on then, Anna. I think everybody probably understands what the issue here is, that basically we're adding together the emissions that come from the fuel production and distribution phase to those which traditionally have been the ones that have been used, particularly in the IMO calculations, which are solely around the fuel combustion to get that full fuel life cycle. For traditional fossil fuels, the vast majority of the emissions are at the fuel combustion phase, whereas for many of the alternatives, the balance is very different, with maybe close to zero allocated to the combustion phase and a much greater value in the fuel production and distribution phase, proportionally, certainly. If you could click on again. I was in two minds as to whether to throw in some example values, because as soon as you put numbers there, people get hung up on the numbers. I think this is just an example table to show what might be the case for different traditional fossil fuels from the sector, so you can just get a feel of the balance between the upstream and the combustion for different fuel types. I suspect that these numbers are themselves now out of date, and I'll come back to why that might be in a minute. So if you could click on again, just to give a feel for what that might look like for a biofuel. This is an example. Actually, it's taken more for a road transport fuel, but the principle is the same, that when you look at a biofuel, the emissions in the upstream phase are coming a lot of the time from the agricultural inputs and the agricultural processing, possibly taking into account some land use change depending on what the feedstock is, some transportation to the refinery, then you've got refining emissions for the biofuel, further distribution, and then you get to the use phase, and actually the CO2 that is emitted at the use phase is basically netted off against the sequestration of CO2 that was taken from the atmosphere when the feedstock was growing in the field. So you've got basically a continuous loop on the CO2 side. That's not to say that there aren't tailpipe emissions that would be taken into account if you're looking at a CO2 equivalent, because there will be small amounts of non-CO2 greenhouse gases produced as part of the combustion, so that there may well be a small amount of CO2 equivalent still to be accounted for at that combustion phase. But generally, and certainly not always, you end up with a figure which on a full life cycle basis for a biofuel does tend to be to a certain degree less than the fossil fuel equivalent. But that variation proportionally can be huge depending on the nature of the alternative fuel. If you can click on again. It's also worth pointing out what the UNFCCC gases are that should be taken into account for a CO2 equivalent. From a transport perspective, the vast majority of this from the fuel combustion life cycle is the CO2, the nitrous oxide and the methane. The others are much more likely to come in if you're doing a calculation that will include the issues around refrigeration and leakage of refrigeration gases, which is not our primary concern here. If you can click on then again. So moving back to what I was saying at the start about establishing a consensus, I think that's the key thing that we were discussing during the course of last year. And one of the main issues is there is a very broad list or number of sets of emission factors out there which aren't all in alignment, and what we were starting to do was basically pull together a full, or as close as we could, as a full list of emission factors that would be useful to Sea Cargo Charter as a full list. And we did that consultation back in the autumn. We've been keeping an eye on what's going on out there in the broader field of emission factors, and also looking at maybe where we can get aligned emission factors for additional fuels that weren't in that first list. And we also had the discussion, if you remember, with RSB as an approach to bring in certified emission factors for actual fuel used where signatories might have that option. So if you can then click again. So when I talk about lots of possible sources, here are a selection. The ones in green have all been used to feed into the final draft of ISO 14083, which is the standard which is now out at final draft from ISO for greenhouse gas calculation and reporting in transport as a whole. And in parallel to that, we know that, as John Mark has mentioned, that the IMO has this consultation group ongoing. I have been trying to engage through the European Commission with the IMO group in a proactive way to try to get the work of that ISO 14083 group taken into account by the IMO. Unfortunately, at the moment, that has not worked for bureaucratic reasons within ISO, which for the interest of time I won't go into. So my concern at the moment is that there is a risk that IMO may come with something that won't align with ISO 14083, and I'm going to continue to try my utmost to do what I can to try to prevent that to happen. At the same time, I know that the consultation group is, I mean, it has the European Commission as part of its coordinators. The European Commission is well aware of some of these sources in green. So it may well be that my worry about that risk of misalignment with between the IMO and ISO is misplaced, but time will tell. At the moment, the IMO group, is still looking at methodology. It hasn't got to the point of coming with numbers yet. And the fact that it hasn't got to the numbers stage actually makes me skeptical whether it's going to be able to be in a position to publish something useful by the middle of 2023, which in itself might have implications as to whether or not we practically want to continue to wait, or whether we decide that we can go ahead with something which is likely to be close to that. And that's the purpose of the sort of the parallel work stream on emission factors that we've been looking at. I think it's also really important to note that the whole issue of emission factors is by definition a moving piece, and you'll see that Eco-Invent 3.8, which is a broadly used life cycle analysis database, is referenced within the ISO work. And actually Eco-Invent has recently released a 3.9 set of data, and that actually increases the well to tank element of many of the fossil fuels quite significantly, probably by up to sort of 30–40%, which actually has the happy coincidence of bringing things probably closer into line with some of the fuel EU values that the Commission has. So it might actually reduce any possible misalignment, but it shows that waiting for a final set of numbers is in itself probably an unlikely activity that we should do, because if you wait for a set of numbers that is somehow fixed and is then never going to change further, then you're probably never going to implement this. So I think I'll probably stop there on the emission factor side of things, and see where we go.
Thank you, Ellen. I have slides, but I don't mean to go through them because we're over time already, but just so that you know, there are 3 more slides which summarize the discussions that we have on 1.5 in the association until now. We will circulate a slide deck afterwards so you can all go through it. As Jan mentioned at the beginning, this year there will be 2 opportunities for us to have this conversation in a more formal way and get an approval, and that's going to be the annual meeting in May, which is in all your calendars already, and then we're aiming to have 1 more signatories meeting in November. So you'll receive the slide deck in after this workshop.
And meantime, thanks for Jean-Marc.